Hi, boys and girls. Before we left school, we started reading The Secret Garden. Now, the one that we were reading was the actual classic. I have found a smaller version, and I know it's backwards to you, but I thought this would be a good way for us to finish the book so you can hear what happens to Mary and Colin and Dickon and maybe do a little bit of writing about their experience. So I'm going to start at the beginning. This will not take that long. I'm going to try with this segment to get through 3 chapters, and then we'll have another one another day. Here we go. Chapter 1, Misselthwaite Manor. When Mary Lennox came to Misselthwaite Manor to live with her uncle, everyone said she was the most disagreeable looking child ever seen. She arrived from India after an epidemic of deadly cholera had swept through that country like a hot, relentless wind. Many people had died, and among them were Mary's parents. Now, were it not for her uncle, Archibald Craven, Mary would have found herself quite alone in the world. She did not miss her parents, for she had hardly known them. Her father had always been busy, and her mother, who had not wanted a little girl at all, had handed her over to the care of servants from the time Mary was born. As she was a sickly child, all the servants obeyed her and gave her her own way in everything. And now that her parents and all her servants were gone, she fully expected that whoever took care of her next would continue to obey her and give her whatever she demanded. Mary had a thin little face and a thin little body, thin light hair, and a very sour expression. She never smiled, not once during the long voyage to England. This she made under the care of an officer's wife, who was rather glad to hand her over to the woman that Mr. Archibald Craven sent to meet her in London, his housekeeper, Mrs. Medlock. "My word, she is a plain little piece of goods," said Mrs. Medlock of Mary, who pretended not to hear. "Perhaps she will improve as she grows older," the officer's wife said good-naturedly. "She'll have to alter a good deal," answered Mrs. Medlock, "and there's nothing likely to improve children at Misselthwaite, if you ask me." Mary did not like the stout woman, whose flushed face she found common, but as she very seldom liked people, there was nothing remarkable in that. Still, she could not help but wonder about her uncle and the place he lived in. She had heard he was a hunchback. What was a hunchback, she wondered. She had never seen one. The next day they set out on their journey to Yorkshire. Mary sat in her corner of the railway carriage and looked plain and fretful. Her black dress made her skin look yellower than ever, and her limp hair straggled from under her black hat. "I suppose you might as well be told something about where you're going to," said Mrs. Medlock gruffly. "It's a queer place." Mary said nothing at all. Mrs. Medlock looked rather put out by her apparent indifference, but went on. "The house is 600 years old, and it's on the edge of the moor, and there's near 100 rooms in it, though most of them shut up and locked. And there's a park round it, and gardens and trees." She paused and took a breath. "But there's nothing else," she said suddenly. Mary sat still. "What you're to be kept at Misselthwaite Manor for, I don't know. He's not going to trouble himself about you, that's for sure and certain. He never troubles himself about no one." Mary stopped herself as if she had remembered something just in time. "He's got a crooked back," she said. "That set him wrong. He was a sour young man and got no good of all his money and big place till he was married." Mary's eyes turned toward Mrs. Medlock, in spite of her intention to seem not to care. Seeing this, the housekeeper continued. "She was a sweet, pretty thing, and he'd have walked the world over to get her a blade of grass she wanted. When she died—" "Oh, did she die?" Mary exclaimed, quite without meaning to. Suddenly she felt sorry for Mr. Archibald Craven. "Yes," Mrs. Medlock answered, "and it made him queerer than ever. He cares about nobody, he won't see people, and 10 to 1 he won't see you. Most of the time he goes away, and when he's at Misselthwaite he shuts himself up in the west wing." Mary gazed out the train window at the gray rainstorm, which looked as if it would go on forever. "You mustn't expect that there will be people to talk to you," Mrs. Medlock said. "You'll have to play alone and look after yourself." The grayness grew heavier and heavier before Mary's eyes, and she fell asleep. It was quite dark when she awakened. "You have had a sleep," Mrs. Medlock said. "We're at Thwaite Station. A carriage is waiting. We have a long drive before us." Inside the carriage, Mary sat and looked out the window, curious to see something of the road over which she was being driven to the queer place Mrs. Medlock had spoken of. There was no knowing what might happen in a house with 100 rooms, nearly all shut up, a house standing on the edge of a moor. On and on they drove through the darkness, and though the rain stopped, the wind rushed by and whistled and made strange sounds. Mary felt that the wide, bleak moor was an expanse of black ocean through which she was passing on a strip of dry land. "I don't like it," she said to herself. "I don't like it," and she pinched her thin lips tightly together. Mary could not see the house clearly when at last they arrived, except that it was immensely long and seemed to ramble around a stone court. One window in an upstairs corner showed a dull glow. "You are to take her to her room," a thin old man instructed Mrs. Medlock. "He doesn't want to see her. He's going to London in the morning." And then little Mary was led up a staircase and down a long corridor, and then down another and another, until finally a door was opened, and she found herself in a room with a fire and a supper on the table. "Well, here you are," said Mrs. Medlock. "This room and the next are where you'll live, and you must keep to them. Don't you forget that." It was in this way that Mary Lennox arrived at Misselthwaite Manor, and she had perhaps never felt quite so disagreeable in all her life. Chapter 2. Martha. The next morning Martha was awakened by a young housemaid whose name was Martha. "It's time for thee to get up now," said Martha in a broad Yorkshire accent. "Mrs. Medlock said I was to carry thy breakfast into the room next to this." "Who's going to dress me?" demanded Mary. "Cannot thou dress thyself?" Martha uttered in amazement. "No," answered Mary quite indignantly. "I never did in my life." "Well," said Martha, "it's time thou should learn." It was something of a shock to Mary that the servants in Yorkshire were not in the least like the servants she had known in India. She suddenly felt horribly lonely and far away from everything she understood. "Those are not my clothes," she said moments later, standing before the wardrobe. "Mine are black." "Mr. Craven ordered Mrs. Medlock to get them in London," said Martha, helping Mary to button up. "He said I won't have a child dressed in black wandering about like a lost soul. It'd make the place sadder than it is. Put color on her." Secretly, Mary was glad. She didn't like black things. When she went into the next room, a good hearty breakfast awaited her. "I don't want it," said Mary, who had always had a very small appetite. "Thou doesn't want thy porridge?" exclaimed Martha. "If my brothers and sisters were at this table, they'd clean it bare in 5 minutes." "Why?" asked Mary coldly. "Why?" echoed Martha. "Because they scarce ever had their stomachs full in their lives. There's 12 of 'em, and my father only gets 16 shilling a week. They're as hungry as young hawks and foxes." "I don't know what it is to be hungry," said Mary. "Well, it would do thee good to try it," declared the young maid. And after Mary drank some tea and ate a little bit of toast, Martha said, "You wrap up warm now and run out and play." "Will you go with me?" asked Mary. Martha stared. "You'll go by yourself," she answered. "You'll have to learn to play like other children does. Our Dickon goes off on the moor by himself and plays for hours. That's how he made friends with the pony he now calls his own. He's got sheep on the moor that knows him, and birds as come and eats out of his hand." "Who is Dickon?" asked Mary. "My brother, miss. He's 12 years old. Dickon's a kind lad, and animals like him." Mary had never possessed a pet of her own, and she had always thought she should like one. So she began to feel a slight interest in Dickon, and as she had never before been interested in anyone but herself, it was the dawning of a healthy sentiment. It was, in fact, this mention of Dickon which made Mary decide to go out. Martha showed her the way to the gardens. "But there's one garden's locked up," she said. "No one has been in it for 10 years. "Why?" Mary asked. 10 years was a long time. She had been born 10 years ago. Mr. Craven had it shut when his wife died so sudden. He won't let no one go inside. It was her garden. He locked the door and dug a hole and buried the key. Martha turned down the walk that led to the gardens. She could not help thinking about the garden that no one had been in for 10 years. Here there was another locked door added to the 100 in a strange house. Mary looked about her as she walked. There were trees and flower beds and evergreens clipped into strange shapes, and a large pool with an old gray fountain in its midst. But the flower beds were bare and wintry, and the fountain was not playing. At the end of the path that she was following there was a wall with a door in it. The door stood wide open. Inside was a garden, with walls all around it, only one of several walled gardens that seemed to open into one another. Mary came upon a second door and turned its handle. She hoped the door would not open because she wanted to be sure she had found the mysterious garden. But the door did open quite easily, and she walked through it and found herself in an orchard. Walls ran along it also. One wall, which was covered with dark green ivy, seemed to extend beyond the orchard as if it enclosed a place on the other side. Mary moved slowly along the walk that ran beside it. She could see the tops of trees on the other side of the wall, and when she stood still she saw a bird with a bright red breast sitting on the topmost branch of one of them, and suddenly he burst into his winter song, almost as if he had caught sight of her and was calling to her. She stopped and listened to him, and somehow his cheerful, friendly whistle gave her a pleased feeling. Even a disagreeable little girl may be lonely, and the big closed house, and the big bare moor, and big bare gardens had made this one feel as if there were no one left in the world but herself. The bright-breasted little bird brought an expression to her sour face that was almost a smile. She listened to him until he flew away. She liked him and wondered if she should see him again. Perhaps he lived in the mysterious garden and knew all about it. Perhaps it was because she had nothing whatever to do that she thought so much of the garden, of the deserted garden. She was curious about it and wanted to see what it was like. Why had Mr. Archibald Craven buried the key? If he had liked his wife so much, why did he hate her garden? She thought of the robin and of the way he seemed to sing a song at her, and as she remembered the treetop he perched on, she stopped walking rather suddenly along the path. I believe that tree was in the secret garden. I feel sure it was, she said. There was a wall round the place, and there was no door. That night, after Mary had finished her supper, she turned to Martha as they sat before the fire. Why does Mr. Craven hate the garden? She said. Art thou thinking more about that garden yet? Said Martha. I knew thou would. That was just the way with me when I first heard about it. Why does he hate it? Mary persisted. It was Mrs. Craven's garden that she had made when first they were married, answered Martha. Him and her used to go in and stay there hours and hours, readin' and talkin' and tendin' the flowers. There was an old tree with a branch bent like a seat on it, and she made roses grow over it, and she used to sit there. But one day, when she was sitting there, the branch broke, and she fell on the ground and was hurt so bad that the next day she died. The doctors thought he'd go out of his mind and die too. That's why he hates it. No one's never gone in since, and he won't let anyone talk about it. Mary did not ask any more questions. She looked at the red fire and listened to the wind howling outside the house. But as she was listening, she began to hear something else. She did not know what it was, because at first she could scarcely distinguish it from the wind itself. Do you hear anyone crying? She said. Martha looked confused. No, she answered, it's the wind. But listen, said Mary, it's in the house, down one of those long corridors. And at that very moment a great rushing draught blew along the passage, and the door of the room they sat in was blown open with a crash, and the crying sound could be heard more plainly than ever. There, said Mary, I told you so. It is the wind, said Martha stubbornly, and she ran and shut the door. But Something troubled and awkward in her manner made Mary stare very hard at her. She did not believe that Martha was speaking the truth.